During the height of World War II, the Netherlands suffered what is now called the Dutch Hunger Winter. In 1944, due to the advances of the Allied forces, the Nazis placed a food embargo in the German-occupied regions of the Netherlands. As a result, at least 20,000 people died during that period, and many more barely survived, having withstood severe malnutrition. So that we can fully understand how this historical event is relevant for understanding inheritance, we will need to answer a few questions. In the eternal debate between nature and nurture, where does one end and the other one begin? How can cells that have the same genetic code inside your body give rise to extremely differentiated parts of your body? From your ugly toes, sorry, we all have them, to your beautiful colored irises. And how does this mechanism relate to a famine that happened over 80 years ago? This is the psychology of everything. Well, scientists, being the curious cats they are known to be, proceeded to study the people who suffered through the Dutch hunger period in order to better understand the consequences of famine and severe malnutrition. One particularly interesting group that was studied many years later were the people who were in the womb of their mothers while they were severely malnourished. Basically, scientists began studying the long-term effects of pregnancy malnutrition. Surprisingly, these people had a much higher likelihood of dying at a younger age due to an increased risk of heart and metabolic diseases like diabetes, and even an increased risk of developing mental disorders like schizophrenia. So, what mechanism is behind this? Epigenetics. But what in the hell is that? Well, epigenetics literally means above the genes. This scientific field concerns itself with how the environment shapes the expression of our genes. But what is that exactly? As I said in the previous video, genes are a kind of information string where given patterns give rise to specific proteins, which in turn execute the necessary functions in cells. But there are a lot of steps involved between the genes themselves, the original information source, and the proteins produced. Epigenetics basically influences those intermediary steps. So, it has an influence right above the genes. And one of the main ways this happens is through methylation. Remember that name, it is important, and I will explain it further down the line. This is what happened to the children of the Dutch hunger. Studies show that a specific gene related to insulin and growth factor was differentially methylated for those who were in the womb during the Dutch winter and those who were not. And that this difference should be present well into adulthood. This is actually amazing for a variety of reasons. First, it means you can inherit some very impactful characteristics for the rest of your life that are not present in your genes. And it makes the barrier between nature and nurture totally blurred. Is your mother's womb part of your nature or part of your nurture? Well, whichever it is, don't ignore it when thinking about what influences people in the long run. The womb, the time you spent in your mother's womb, matters. So do you remember the second question in the beginning of the video? I asked how cells with identical DNA could originate your beautiful eyes and your toes at the same time. There must be something above your genes then, right? You get it? Above your genes? Epigenetics? What? When we are conceived, all of our cells can become any part of our bodies. That means they are called omnipotent. You probably know these cells as stem cells. They can also be called, instead of omnipotent, totipotent. Totipotent? Omnipotent. But as time goes by, your cells need to specialize, and so they do. They become pluripotent. They can still become a lot of different parts of your body, but not all of them. They aren't godlike anymore. Until finally they become unipotent, fully specialized cells who can only be one thing and nothing more. Imagine the desolation and shattered dreams that occur during this process. Maybe a lot of them wanted to become rock singers, and instead they end up in the middle of your intestines. Sad stuff indeed, sad stuff. Cells' functioning and specialization is tied to the proteins they produce. If they are eye cells, they produce eye proteins. If they are feet cells, feet protein. Okay, so time for the disclaimer. As always, this is a tremendous oversimplification and kind of a joke. So just know that cells' functioning is dependent on the proteins they produce. It's much better to think of this like cells that are muscles or blood vessels and not necessarily eye or feet proteins. Okay? Every cell has a specific function. But what is the process that gives rise to this specialization? It's a process you've already heard the name of: methylation. What this process describes is the way your body has to disable the intermediate steps between the information in your genes and the production of proteins. It's the way by which the reading of that information is disabled. They become unreadable, your genes do, and therefore the protein is not produced. So, in an omnipotent cell, that one that can become anything, there is no methylation. And as it specializes further into becoming a specialized foot cell, all the DNA regarding eye or hand proteins is made inaccessible because it is not necessary for the healthy functioning of that cell and your organism. This to me is absolutely amazing. The process by which your cells containing the same genetic information specialize is the same, in principle, that the one which led children of the Dutch hunger to be at risk of dying younger due to metabolic diseases. Finally, although this video and the last one have been primarily focused on the genetic and epigenetic factors of inheritance, there is much more that we inherit. With the invention of private property, wealth can be passed through the generations and, in many cases, having a more substantial impact than our genetic inheritance. Additionally, humans' ability to communicate symbolically and to learn extensively allows us to inherit knowledge from our ancestors. We inherit ways to look at the world from our parents, primary caretakers, and even friends. Inheritance is not a strict concept that applies only to very narrow situations and concepts. What we inherit shapes us into becoming who we are, but often the substantive parts of our inheritance are not our genes. It is also our genes, but it is also the environment of our mother while pregnant. It is the monetary inheritances that we receive. It is the cultural lenses through which we look at the world and the biases of our society. It is our parents' teachings. It is epigenetics. It is much more than we tend to admit. And so, if you learned anything from these two videos, is that inheritance is a much broader concept than we usually give it credit for. So I hope you enjoyed it, and it would be really cool if I could inherit a simple like or a comment from you. So take care and see you next time. Bye.